Okay, so we're going to get started again in segment 2. And for the audience, the questions, the order of answering questions, we've asked all our panelists to pull numbers, and they were selected in order by that way. So
the number 1 position is Mr. Edwards. And our first question is, please give an example of a decision that may have been made differently if the council had at-large members.
I don't know if I can give you a specific example, but when you look across Prince George's County, say for an example, the developed side of the county, which is west of 495, there's been absolutely nothing done in terms of some of the metro stations, where in other areas where the council person is just a great deal stronger, there's more activities around those stations. Now, if we had an at-large member, I do believe that all of the stations and all of those areas would be developed appropriately. So that's one of the examples that I can give, is just west of 495 has been neglected. That's a developed tier of the county.
All right. That same question to Mr. Estep. Please give an example of a decision that may have been made differently if the council had at-large members.
I think I can give a couple of examples. First of all, the regional networks, the Council of Governments, the Transportation Planning Board, those bodies that you're not even familiar with that make really large decisions about the quality of our lives on a day-to-day basis. The people from Northern Virginia, for the most part, have been on that body as elected officials for years. They clean our clocks all the time. You want to know why there are more metro stations open in one particular part of the region? It's because they're there. We don't have that. If you take a big development project that's going to be beneficial to the county, to get a countywide perspective might be good as opposed to a district where the project is specifically going to be. That balance could then help people make better decisions.
Thank you. On to Mr. Denogo.
I will give 2, but first, with regard to the Council of Governments, it's not a decision-making body. It's an information body, information sharing. And with regard to the only decisions they make is the Transportation Planning Board, and you don't need experience. Mr. Harrington did a great job for the County Council on the Transportation Planning Board, and all they do is put you on a list for long-range projects so you're eligible for federal funding. So this COG discussion is really not an accurate statement. 2 decisions. Back in 2006, council members were concerned about some of the actions that Mr. Johnson was taking regarding the county fiscal situation and contracts and things. And we put 4 ballot questions on that he vetoed. If we had 2 at-large members, 8 council members, we could have not overridden that veto. We overrode it because we had 6 out of 9 votes. That would not happen if there were at-large seats. Same thing happened with chair of the Planning Commission appointment in 2010. It was a very unqualified person put up. We shot it down. He vetoed. We overrode the veto. We couldn't have done it if there were at-large members.
Thank you. On to Ms. Dudley.
Well, I'm not exactly sure, because I don't have a crystal ball as to which decision would have been a better one. But I do know that as we have been having conversations about the Prince George's County Hospital Center, we have to really look at whether or not having the 9 council members sit as our Board of Health is problematic. They could possibly take that money and establish a true Board of Health, because none of the members of the County Council are physicians. So there's problems inherently in the charter that are not even being addressed by adding 2 more people.
Thank you. And on to Mr. Cooper.
And I don't have an answer to that question, and I don't think anyone who's spoken as of yet has had an answer to that question. But given that that's one of the main reasons that the proponents of this case are saying that we need it, it is troublesome. But I would say that for me, property taxes are not set by district. The school budget is not set by district. It's set countywide. We're talking about how people are elected. They're elected by districts, but they make decisions every day based on the whole county. And I don't think that represents, I guess, a flaw in the candidate you elected if you elect a candidate, or if you elect a candidate who only thinks out of the district. I think it's quite possible to do it every day, make decisions for the county-wide.
Thank you. On to Mr. Harrington.
So I would say decisions like expanding, for example, if we would have had at-large members, we probably would have gotten funding quicker for things like the Purple Line, for things like Woodrow Wilson Bridge, for projects like creative regional centers like at National Harbor. And actually, you know, my colleague here is correct that being involved with COG, being involved with National Association of Counties allows you the access to those federal dollars that sometimes that you don't have. So without having years of presence, if you will, in relationships, that's why sometimes we don't get the federal dollars and the federal monies that we deserve. And so this is not just, you know, to respect, this is not just a local issue. If people were elected to you know, for trash pickup and snow removal, then you don't get the kind of sophisticated infrastructure that certainly is needed with an expanding county and presence like Prince George's County.
Thank you. Now, moving on to our next question to Mr. Edwards. Who is funding the effort to promote Question D? Have they formed a campaign finance entity with a treasurer?
To support Question D, the funding for any literature or anything of that nature is strictly voluntary. It's given by individuals, some corporate donors, but it's as any, and these individuals do not have any interest in running for any of these offices. They are just looking out for what they feel, what we feel, and I won't use the term they because I'm a part of it, feel that is in the interest of Prince George's County. And that's what we are looking at, and that's what we raise funds to do, is to promote our belief in terms of the quality of life for Prince George's County.
Thank you, Mr. Edwards. Mr. Estep?
I can't answer that question because I'm not involved in any group that is formed with the State Board of Elections and is authorized to take a position one way or the other. I certainly can't tell you about the opposition other than having seen some of the literature that's out there, most of which is inaccurate.
Thank you. On to Mr. Dinogo.
Well, first let me address no on Question D has a finance committee, and it's the Prince George's Civic Federation is organized with civic activists. I think they've raised about $1,000 in small contributions from citizens. That's the opposition, David versus Goliath. We don't know what's going on with the pro side because it's shadowy. We know that they have a committee, it's the Recharge at Large. We know that the treasurer is the same person who was the chair of the effort that raised $150,000 from developers 2 years ago. Okay. Many of those developers and other special interests had business in front of the county government, and you have seen legislation adopted or attempted to be adopted for those same people who funded 2 years ago. You don't know today because the financing for campaigns is filed so late in the campaign season, and 2 years ago they filed late so that you really couldn't tell until literally right before the election or after. So this, in 2014, it was shadowy, murky, and when you found out, it looked very untoward. We don't know now. We know that there's a committee set up, and by the way, that chairperson, that treasurer, is also the treasurer for Rasher and Baker's campaign. And so when you start looking at the moving parts as a private citizen, you get a little unsettled.
Thank you. On to you, Ms. Dudley.
Well, I can only say what I know, and that is that as a member of the Prince George's County Democratic Central Committee in the 47th District. We listened to commentary from Senator Rosapep and Derek Davis on the county council, and they came before us and asked the Democratic Central Committee to vote to put question D on the ballot and for us to support question D. It did not carry the 2/3 majority that it needed because basically the members of the Democratic Central Committee have common sense. And they realize that the citizenry, and we're the grassroots people, and our people are telling us that it's a bad idea. So I know that there is some behind the scenes pushing on the upper levels of politics in the county. And if the senators, the state senator is willing to come forward and ask us to support it and claim that the senators are supporting it, I can only go by what he testified in front of me saying.
All right, thank you, Ms. Dudley. On to Mr. Cooper.
Okay, in two parts. And one more again, I want to highlight just again that a member of the Democrat Central Committee and a member of the Republican Central Committee are agreeing in opposition to this. So this should give you this little bit of pause to examine this bill and look at really what's going on. But to that point, 30 words of the 60 words of question D that's going to be on the referendum deal with extending term limits. And so as Tom mentioned, you can look back to 2014 and see who funded the 2014 effort to do term limits. We had $20,000 given by the Walton Group, which is building the Westphalia project, $50,000 from Kenneth Michael, who did development work with the area, $5,000 from the Peterson Group, who's doing National Harbor. Over $100,000 was given just 2 years ago to extend term limits. So follow the money. This is the same people who are doing this effort. And as he mentioned, the campaign finance reports would be issued after the election like it was last time. And, you know, I'll make the bet now, $1, that it would be the same groups that funded it 2 years ago who are funding this effort.
Thank you. On to Mr. Harrington.
Like Mr. Eastep, I'm unfamiliar with, and I'm not here as a means of anybody who's funding question D. If you look at my own history, I have always been, when I was on several commissions or what have you, I've always promoted at-large seats, and so I'm here as a volunteer, still promoting a change in government. Having said that, I would be very weary of trying to connect dots that may or may not be there. So to suggest that, well, you know, developers have funded this, and so this is the reason why it's a bad thing. I'm not sure that connecting those dots in that way is a way of saying that now we have bad government because some people feel one way or the other. Or that politicians are being bought off. I think that is again, a very skeptical way of looking at that. And having been a former politician, I was never swayed by, you know, developers or what have you. You looked at the argument, you looked at what's best for the community, and I trust the public to make the right decisions based on who they want to see in leadership.
Thank you. All right, moving on to our next question to Mr. Edwards. You've drawn number one. How will the change impact attracting major employers to the county, such as Amazon, who is building cloud data centers and hiring 1,000 employees each year?
I'm not in a position to address that, so I defer to someone else with more experience in that area.
I don't think anybody's foolish enough to think that any one action like adding 2 additional council members is going to guarantee that Amazon is going to be here. What these large companies do is they look at a jurisdiction overall, and they want to know, how does that government operate? How are the people in that jurisdiction? How is the public to deal with? Are they going to oppose every project that comes up simply because there's a developer behind it? Is everything that has a large company attached to it bad? Is the government one that is transparent? Is it a government that is going to make good decisions based on the facts that are presented to them? What is their funding? In our case, we have trim that limits the amount of revenue that we can raise. The only change that's been made, the first time in 38 years, was to give 4 cents toward education. We're contributing the lowest amount of our local revenue to education of any jurisdiction in the Washington area. That's the kind of thing that's going to hamper Amazon from coming here.
I got it. Thank you. I'm trying to figure out who to ask next. All right. I'm going to, at this point, give Mr. Harrington a break, and I'm going to ask him this question. How will the change impact attracting major employers to the county, such as Amazon, who is building cloud data centers and hiring 1,000 employees each year?
Thank you for the question. What I would say, and in my recent experience, is that one of the things that business looks at when making decisions in the jurisdiction is certainty. Right? Who are the relationships that they have to build? What are the barriers, or what are the pathways to helping to help that business grow or be significant in a certain jurisdiction? And so what this would allow is again, who do I have to deal with in order to then have this business located in Prince George's County, and what are the other institutions that are in place or policy that is in place to allow that to grow? So I can't speak to Amazon per se, but I can tell you that one of the key variables that business looks at is certainty. And to the extent then that there is certainty with leadership, then that helps then attract then even higher level businesses to a jurisdiction.
Thank you. Now on to Mr. Cooper.
As far as, I guess the question is, how would it impact the job creation? Amazon opened up a warehouse in Baltimore last year, employed over 2,500 people in Baltimore last year. Baltimore does not have at-large city council seats. And so I would just cite that as an example. As he said earlier, that it doesn't make a difference between whether, they don't look at at-large seats as a determining factor on whether to open up places. I think there's other factors that make that difference, and to try to say that at-large seats is a silver bullet to that, I'll just say look to Baltimore and other areas that may not have at-large seats but are able to attract employers like Amazon.
Okay, thank you. And on to you, Mr. Denoga.
I'd like 30 seconds and defer the other 30.
All right.
This is one of the ephemeral claims that has no substance behind it from the proponents, that there's going to be all kinds of jobs created by at-large. Why? We don't know, just because. It's forward thinking. Call me a skeptic when I hear these types of arguments. I don't mind being a skeptic to arguments that have no basis. All you have to do is look at the jurisdictions in Maryland that don't have at-large seats. Howard County, Anne Arundel, Baltimore County, they're doing gangbusters in terms of jobs and high-tech jobs. We took our high-tech centers and turned them into big box shopping centers for developers who contributed to the question 2 years ago. Why are we doing that for developers? In terms of education, we actually have one of the highest education effort indexes by Maryland Department of Education. Our citizens are putting out their fair share for education.
Thank you. Ms. Dudley?
I think that adding the 2 additional council members is not, as Mr. Denoga said, the silver bullet. And I actually agree with Mr. Estep on what he said, that the emphasis needs to be on our school system. We need college and career-ready individuals. We need students who understand that their actions have an impact on other people. We need to, I could take that $1 million a year and set up an office for restorative practices in our school system so that we could end the school to prison pipeline. We have children being suspended for insubordination and disrespect because they don't know how to treat each other and how to trust somebody. These are really simple things that we can do in our system, and $2 million can make a big impact in what we do every day as educators.
Thank you. Next question to Ms. Dudley. Why would a person who spent 8 years as a district representative be better as an at-large member than someone who hasn't spent so long with a narrow perspective?
Well, sometimes passion and experience are underrated qualities that people can have. I don't believe that anybody because they have 8 years of experience is going to be even better than somebody who doesn't. That's why the Prince George's County Educators Association is looking at Rahela Ahmed for school board seat. She's young, she's bright, she's got passion, she's got a finance degree. So it's not a matter of how long you've been somewhere sometimes, because sometimes people get stuck in the mud and don't want to move and be progressive. So I think that we need to be very mindful of experience versus passion and the willingness to get out there and look at what's new that's coming out and get the job done. And it's not that people aren't qualified. It's just that we need to make sure that they're qualified and that they are moving in the right direction. And they're talking about the things that are important, like the reauthorization of the No Child Left Behind Act and the Every Student Succeed Act. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to put this question to Mr. Estep at this point.
I'd go back again to the leading jurisdiction for economic development, and again, the one that's kind of cleaning our clock here on this side of the Potomac River is Fairfax County. When I was on the Council of Governments, and I came off the council in 2002, there were many of the same people on the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors that are there today. There are several of them that were there then, they're still there. They've been there for many, many years. It's obvious that they had made contacts with everybody in the infrastructure in this region that you need to have in order to advance your jurisdiction. They were so far ahead of the game and so far ahead of us, bringing new people in every 8 years, that we hardly had a chance to get, and sometimes 4 years, we hardly had a chance to get the direction for our seat at the table, and those people were already doing us in. I think to have experience is one of the most important things that is lacking in the system that we have today with term limits in place.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Mr. Cooper now.
And I guess I agree with what's been said earlier, that I don't necessarily think that experience, any type of experience, necessarily makes you a better qualified candidate than someone else. I think the idea in a county of over 900,000 residents that there's only a handful of people who are worthy enough to lead us in office is just, again, against my principles as democracy. I feel like there are hundreds of people, if not thousands of people in this county who could effectively lead the county government. And I think that term limits is a way to keep people from building up too much power. I think both sides of the aisle can agree establishments are not the best. I don't want to get anybody in trouble, but in my opinion, Mike Miller has been, Senate president longer than any Senate president in the country. Touts that as a good thing. I don't think it's so. I think we need sometimes fresh voices in our government. We need fresh perspectives. And I'll just say again, in a county of 900,000 people, I just don't think that there's only a handful of people who are worthy enough to lead us in government. I think given the opportunity, you will have a lot more diversity. If you look at 8 years is more than enough time for the president of our country for the past 200 years to run foreign policy and such. I think it's enough time for us to run the county.
Thank you. On to you, Mr. Denogo.
I think the question is flawed. It has a flawed premise when it refers to narrow view, which I guess is meant to be district members. I was never accused of having a narrow view. And if you have a council member that's got a narrow view, they shouldn't be on the council, bottom line. The people that I serve with had a broad view. We looked at the issues countywide. We shared the budget in terms of how to share resources, and it was a collegial gathering. I don't know that having somebody from a particular part of the county who's at large, who needed that particular part of the county to make sure they got elected, is not going to have their own parochialism. And I think what you get when you get term limits, I've seen it since term limits came in. You get a new set of people who bring energy. They bring some inexperience, but they bring tremendous energy and new ideas, and it resuscitates the council. Because what happens with keeping people longer is they form the wrong relationships. There's an echo chamber in Upper Marlboro. You hang out with the same special interests, and you get to be a little too cozy with them. So the experience is not always a good thing.
Thank you. Mr. Edwards.
Thank you. I think the premises here is that it is believed that someone that is on the council would be the person that would be, persons that would be filling the at-large positions. And I'm somewhat in agreement with Mr. Denoga. The at-large seats would be voted on by the public. And so there's no guarantee that there's anyone on the current council that would be elected as a representative from the at large. It could be, as it has been said before, someone that has never been in public office before. That could be, that is up to the general public who they put in office. And it does not necessarily mean that that position is created for a person that is now serving or had served before. But I would say I would vote for Mr. Harris, Mr. Eastep, or Mr. Denoga for an at-large position based on their qualifications and experience.
Thank you. This is going to be our last question, and Mr. Denoga, you go first. What evidence is there?
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry? Oh. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Harrington. Do you need the question again?
That's all right. No, that's okay. So I think I would reframe the question with that. Can experience be valuable in setting then a strong pathway for providing then leadership? And certainly then experience does count for leadership. And it can be valued. No one is suggesting that experience means negating the new entrants into the political scene. That I think is not a strong argument. The question is can experience matter? And the answer is yes. And we've seen experience matter. As my colleague here on the dais, Mr. Eastep, noted. We're just talking about, for example, mixed-use development on metro stations. You know what? 10 to 15 years ago, Virginia's doing it. They already did it. They had Boston. They had areas in Fairfax County that already had mixed-use development, and we're just talking about it. And why? Because since you've had such changeover in leadership here, to understand the complexities of mixed-use development, to understand the connections between transportation and live near where you work environments, is tough to grasp. And when you don't have those relationships and access to the federal dollars that make that happen, Virginia does wipe us out, if you will, in terms of then being able to accelerate then those kinds of development, those kinds of green infrastructure where we're just talking about it. And so the kind of experience that helps build talent, that helps us then accelerate the kinds of things that we want, is certainly something that we would like to see and needed in Prince George's County.